All right, good afternoon, everyone. Actually, it's morning for us when we're recording this, but I am John, and I'm one of the pastors at 168.
And I'm Carl, and I'm also a pastor here at 168.
Hey, before we get into this whole racial reconciliation conversation, I mean, can you believe that 168 is turning 1 this Sunday? I feel like I just finished fundraising last week.
I can't believe it's been 365 days since we had our first service. I'm so excited just for all the ways that God has moved and all the ways that God is going to move over the next year in the life of our community.
Oh man, it's so crazy. And just so you know, if you're watching this via video, there's also a audio only piece. So if you're driving or something like that and you just want to listen to that piece, you can do that as well. It will be on all of our platforms. All right, take it away, Carl.
All right. So every Monday throughout the month of February, we release a book suggestion, a video excerpt, and an on-ramp to continue on our church's learning journey through Living Undivided, where some of you took the next step and signed up for that journey. So way to go. Kudos to you guys who have signed up for that journey. But additionally, we asked you throughout this month to send in some questions to Pastor John and I, and we're going to take the time to answer those questions today. So in the next few minutes, we're going to take turns answering and dialoguing just about the questions that you all have sent in. So here is question number 1. How do you respond to someone that says, I am colorblind? Talking about this makes things worse.
Yeah, man, that's a great question. I think I'm going to split this question maybe up into 2 different parts. And first, I think for the sake of like identifying some people, I will, for the sake again of generally identifying, I'm going to say progressive friends, and then I'm going to say conservative friends. All right. So first, I think to our progressive friends, I feel like first when I think about people who respond like, "Hey, I'm colorblind," sometimes they mean like when they see you, when they see me, or this hypothetical like third person who's white. I don't think they're always saying that they don't see the beauty of our distinct cultures or ethnic heritage. Because sometimes I feel like when people say, "Hey, I'm colorblind," the first reaction is like, "Oh man, I can't believe you're saying that you don't see my distinct God-given beauty, culture, or heritage." I think what they're trying to say is they're saying, "Hey, I don't want to perceive what's dividing us." And so I think one first word to our progressive again friends is if you find yourself highly offended by this statement when you're having a conversation, I think we would all be better served if we just took time to unpack and say, "Hey, can you clarify what you mean by that?" And if they are saying that they don't see the beauty of your God-given heritage and culture, then obviously there's some more stuff to talk about. But I think with secondly, though, to our conservative friends, on the contrary, all right, and this is where I think we're going to lean in a bit. But back in December, I wrote this blog about Kyle Rittenhouse, and I quoted the U.S. Sentencing Commission, which is a bipartisan independent agency created by Congress to figure out disparities between sentencing. And in November 14, 2017, they released this data. And I know, Carl, you've seen it as well.
Yeah.
But it's basically saying, and listen to these 3 different data points, and then I'll tell you why I feel like saying I don't see color in this respect is unhelpful, right? It said that black male offenders receive sentences on average 20.4% longer than similarly situated white male offenders. And that's according to and taking into account for the offender's past, right? So this is not like some disparity, but it's taking a look at 2 people who are kind of on even planes, but black male offenders receive 20.4% longer sentences. Another one, black male firearm offenders receive sentences that were 19.3% longer than those for white male firearm offenders. And then when it comes to leniency, black male offenders received a sentence 16.8% longer than white male offenders. And I think this speaks to the harsh parts of saying, I don't see color or you don't see color. Because here's my question, right? And Carl, I would love to hear what you think about it. Because if you don't see color, number one, how does that affect how you interpret this data, right? Number 2, how do you lament with your black neighbor who statistically will receive a sentence on average 20% longer than similarly situated white male offenders? Because the only way you're going to be able to work to change an unjust system is if you can embrace that color does make a difference in America. Specifically, this is one way. So I think we have to parse what we mean by I don't see color. We can't assume or presume. But again, if we're simply saying I don't see color, then how is that going to affect the way that you interpret data? Yeah, what do you think, Carl?
Yeah, I love what you're saying. I think the key of what you're saying to it is you have to enter into this dialogue, right? So
Totally.
and when you enter into a dialogue, you have to be open to all sides of the dialogue. And so when it comes to this issue of like color blindness, I think that is one major side that we automatically seem to shut down
Mm-hmm.
in this conversation. Where I think like when you shut down the color part of it, like you're shutting down who a person is and who like what they've experienced based on what they look like, and you're shutting down history honestly in the
Yeah.
conversation. And so I
Yeah.
think in order to dialogue like this, you have to see color. And when I was thinking about this, I go back to like even like the book of Genesis, where like we are all created in the image of God. But then in
Mm.
Corinthians, Paul tells us that we're all like, we're one body made up of many parts, and like each part is different, and that includes the color of our skin, that includes where we're from, our heritage, and our culture. It all plays into who we are, and I think it's the beauty of the multi-lens aspect into a situation, because when we can
Totally.
listen to all the multi-lenses, I think we get a fuller picture of who God is and how He views an issue, when we can come to an understanding of all of us and get to the heart of of what we're trying to talk about in any conversation when it comes to race and reconciliation, or even just like heritage and culture and all those things. So I love that question. I mean, I love
Mm.
your answer to that question, John. I love that you broke it down into two different categories, but I love at the heart of it, we're talking about like this is a key core concept to dialoguing with one another, is
Totally.
understanding of who someone is.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes, right, the piece that I think I lament about is that when phrases like, hey, well, I don't see color get thrown around, there's initial reactions being stirred within our hearts, right? Like,
Yeah.
whether it's like, I agree with you, or like, I can't believe you would say that. And then a lot of times there's like this shutdown that happens internally.
Mm.
Instead of saying, like, hey, like, what do you mean by that? And then can I just share with you and about what really is happening? Here's one example again, maybe the disparity in sentencings, etc. But I think to your point, Carl, like for people of color to say that color doesn't exist is not their reality. It's not lived reality, right? It's like every single day, whether you get into your car, right, or whether you go into a store or whatever it might be, there's a reality which with both of us and you to a different extent and me to a different extent live with because we are people of color. And
Absolutely.
so I would love for people to continue to learn and go through the journey of understanding what does it mean when I use a phrase like, well, I don't see color, and is that really helpful?
Yeah,
Yeah, totally.
absolutely.
Well, here's the second question. I want to toss it to you, Carl. What are some ways that the non-BIPOC community can assist and help with racial reconciliation in America?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we were talking about this a little bit before we jumped on, and I think as I talk about this, even if you're part of the BIPOC community, like I want you to understand that these same things could work for you as well. As I was saying to John, I was like, man, I'm an ally as well, because there are things that like
Mm,
my Asian American brothers and sisters go through that like I don't go through, but I'm an ally. I can be an ally in those moments, or like they don't go through the same things that I go through necessarily, but they can be allies to me. So even if you're a
so
part of the
helpful.
BIPOC community, just think about like the other BIPOC communities you're not a part of, and
Mm,
these same things can help you. But I think the first thing for me is like, yeah, thoughts and prayers are great. Like those are things that we have to do. Let's not throw that out because it's been so
absolutely.
overused. Like you do have to start, and you do have to like pray with them. I mean, even this past Sunday, we spent like 7 minutes in service, like just praying for what's going on in
Yeah.
the world, from the Ukraine to Madagascar to the
Yeah.
African refugees still trying to come over. Like that's also key. But the next step is like you have to use what God has given you uh, to help them. So like tangibly for us, like we are, our church right now is like taking care of refugee families that are coming over. Like we're helping them out and we're setting them up, and we're trying to be their first friends when they come over here. Like it's something we're actionably doing. I mean, we've financially given to causes to help in the relief of the Ukrainians.
Mm,
We've given financially to other missions organizations around the world to help what's going on tangibly. And when the pandemic lifts, like we hope to not only just like give, but to take teams out there to not only see, but tangibly help in the needs that are already going around in the community. And so I think as
totally.
as a non-BIPOC community, I think you just need to look at the blessings that the Lord has give you. Like if it's financially, like step up financially. Like if you have a special skill set based on the job that God has blessed you with, like use that skill set. if you're in a situation and you see something that is foul, like say that it's foul and call it out. If you see, like some brutality going on, whether it's, police brutality or whether it's like human to human brutality, like I think you need to call that out in that moment and not just say like, hey, it'll all take care of itself. Like step
Yeah.
into it, put yourself on the line in those moments and do what you know is right. And
Mm.
sometimes what you feel is right may feel countercultural, and that's okay. Like we look to a Jesus, we look to a God that like lived the countercultural life. Like he did the things that were countercultural because they were right. And in him living counterculturally, like he changed the lives of people and communities for good, for eternity. And so I think
Mm.
that's an example for us to look to. And as I said before, like whether you're a black person looking into another BIPOC community, or an Asian American looking to another BIPOC community, like, or Hispanic looking to another BIPOC community, like we're all allies, and we need to see those things, and we need to like stand up for one another, and be united in the love of Christ, and doing what's right for one another.
Man, can I just say this? I just love your heart for Jesus, right? And even the first question talking about Genesis and Corinthians, and now you're talking about Jesus himself. I mean, that's awesome, right? Because we're always trying to integrate all these types of conversations. We want to see, how does the Bible and Scripture, how does faith inform this conversation that we're having?
Yeah.
And I love the fact that the first response that you gave was, hey, not only as a non-BIPOC community, but me as an Asian American person, right? How do I stand in unity and solidarity with my Black and African American sisters and brothers, right? Because there are different challenges, there are different lenses and realities in which we both live in, even if we qualify under the umbrella of BIPOC, for example.
Yeah.
And I often, and it's true, right? When we have this conversation, a lot of times it's black and white,
Mm-hmm.
but as we recognize, like, hey, there are just different aspects of it, and how can we become an ally for one another and support each other, I think is super helpful tip and advice. I was actually doing some reading, and this is from all of Amnesty International Australia. Okay, this is Australian.
All right.
All right, and I love that God is using this conversation, and it's not just national, right? It's not just domestic, but it's global. But like the 6 steps that you even talked about, Carl, right? It's like acknowledge the problem,
Yep.
that it exists, and then find your platform. I think in the social media culture, we feel like, oh man, something happened, so we have to put it on social media. I don't think that's necessarily true. If that's an avenue that is helpful for you and you have a platform in that way, then engage in that way. If it's a personal conversation that you're having, then utilize that facet. Whatever the facet is that God has for you. But it's like, acknowledge the problem, face the uncomfortable truth, listen to the people who experience racism, educate yourself, engage in conversation, and then what you just said, take action.
Absolutely.
Right? Don't let it just stop with education, but what action is God calling you to take?
I love that. 6 simple steps right there. There's 6 steps for you to look at.
Yeah.
Definitely get that out. I think that's great information for everyone to think about.
I don't claim that at all, right? I didn't write that. That was Amnesty International Australia.
One of the things you said, John, that I love is you in that 6 steps, it's educate yourself, right? And I think a key distinction in that, just for our non-BIPOC community, like educating yourself isn't asking a person in the BIPOC community questions about their experiences or their history. I think there's a distinction there where we have to think of it as like, when you're asking someone within the BIPOC community about their experience, you're actually asking them to relive a trauma that they may or may not have dealt with, and you could be re-triggering them as well. So when we say educate yourself, I mean it's things like do your own reading, right? There's a big thing about books that are banned right now. Like there are some good books that are banned right now because of the history that they tell about racism in America. Like, go read those books and like do your research for yourself and form your opinions about those things without asking a member of the BIPOC community. I think when someone in the BIPOC community is ready to talk about their experience and talk about their traumatic experiences, they will share. They will gladly share. But to ask them a question, maybe in a one-on-one setting or a one-on-3 setting or at all, when they're not ready, is a triggering traumatic, reliving trauma for them. So I think the educate piece, I think I just wanted to highlight that. But I think it leads a little bit into our next question, John, I think I have for you, is like, what grieves you the most when it comes to evangelicalism and racial reconciliation in the Chicagoland area?
Wow. I love the question because we're, if you're watching this and you don't know who we are, for example, we are in the Chicagoland area. And so we just wanted to take some time to specifically address, both of us having been in ministry for X amount of years, like what have we seen and what have we experienced personally, or even just from afar, from a third person viewing into evangelicalism, for example. But I've thought about this, and I thought a lot about actually the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? And the parable of the Good Samaritan is primarily about Jesus being our perfect Samaritan. But as I wonder about the church, especially in Chicagoland, I just began to wonder, is the church like really as the Good Samaritan does, like stopping, right?
Yep.
Stopping the mode of ministry, of the urgency of needing to get done whatever we're trying to get done. And I understand that rush and that demand is really real, right? So I know I don't look like it, but I've been in ministry now for over 15 years. And I know that's not like 30 years or anything, but I understand like the constant grind of shepherding and weddings, funerals, like crisis that happens in addition to your regular ministry demands. But I got to believe that the Good Samaritan also had some pressing needs, but he stopped, right? He paused, and then he saw, he felt uncomfortable, he put himself in danger, he was empathizing, he was sacrificially giving, he circled back, and then he took collective responsibility over something that wasn't necessarily his responsibility, right? And when I think about just kind of the Chicagoland landscape, and we do this too as a church at 168, so I'm not saying that we don't do this, but I think a lot of times in the Chicagoland landscape, in light of the pressures of ministry, what we end up doing is we send out a tweet over MLK weekend, right? Or on our social platforms. Or we do like a panel about race and reconciliation, once every 5 years, once every 6 years. And then as a church, we feel like we did our due diligence. Like that was our responsibility and we're done with it.
Yeah.
And there's a guy who says, and I don't like this quote, but I think it's real. He says, when you're sick of saying it, like you as a pastor or leader, when you're sick of saying it, the leaders in your ministry have probably just heard it. And when your leaders are sick of hearing it, then everybody else in your church has heard it for the first time. But I just want to say this, and I'm going to toss it back to you. If that is true, right? And our churches are only talking about this once a year via tweet, or once every 3, 5 years, 6 years through a panel, our people will inevitably think, oh, like that's the bar of relevance in my life, right? They won't hear it. They'll think, oh, if I just tweet something out or attend a panel once every 5 years, like that's how my faith intersects with racial reconciliation. But I mean, it can't, right? Like that can't be the normative rhythm. And so I think that's one of the areas that I'm grieving and trying to process and think through. How can I be a voice of trying to even normalize it in our church culture and rhythm? What would you say?
I love that you use the term rhythm, because I think part of the rhythm, even that 168, that we're trying to establish is this rhythm of like lamenting is normal. And I think when I think about evangelicalism and racial reconciliation in Chicagoland, for me, one of the things that grieves me is that when I think about the years that I've been in the church and the years that I've been in ministry, I don't know if we've ever taught ourselves or other people how to lament as a form of worship. And so I think when things happen, as far as like reconciling what happened in our nation, like you have to lament the things that have happened for decades, for hundreds of years in our nation's history, in order to move forward. Because in that, we need to allow God to move those things, from the grievance of our heart and the hardness of our heart to his glory and his praise, right? So we have to allow God to move us in that, but we can't allow God to move us from a place that we don't know exists. And in order to get there, we need to lament. And so I think one of my biggest grievances is that we were never really taught how to lament, right? Even I think we just had a past conversation just talking about Resurrection Sunday and things that are coming up, and just how so much we like to even just fast forward through Good Friday, and at the end of Good Friday we jump right to the hope of Sunday, and sitting in what lamenting looked like on that Friday, where like this person that of Jesus that these people had grown to follow and seen these miracles with had actually died, and like they didn't know if he was coming back. It was the moment of like, is he who he says he is? And that was a lamentous moment for them, because that was their leader, that was the person who had changed the culture. And we even forget about Saturday, where they had no idea, was he coming back? Like, is he still real? Like, what's going on? What's happening? Like, so this lamenting is not, it's a big piece of worship that I think we've missed over decades. And I think that's one of the things that that just grieves me, because we can see it now when things are coming to a head, like the Ukraine issue, or just even like the George Floyds and the the Tamir Rices and the things that have happened in America, where we as a country, specifically as Christian ambassadors to this country, like we've had a hard time lamenting what was going
Mm,
on so much that it caused like a fight because we couldn't sit in grief with one another. We could
mm.
only see like the hope. Like we wanted to push people to the hope and the victory when they needed to grieve the loss and they needed to grieve what the reality of their life actually is so that they can sit in that place and allow God to move them forward
Wow.
in his praise and his glory.
This is why I love doing this with you, right? Like that piece of lament. I know we've talked about it,
Yeah.
but wow, yeah, totally, right? I totally resonate with that. And we've talked about, right, even Sunchan Rai. I think he's at Westminster now, but
Yeah.
he talks about how in CCLI music, right, the Christian music, like 90% of our music is just victory. It's about, hey God, you have won, you're victorious, which is of course a theology that we want to embrace, that we celebrate. But
Absolutely.
what about all the psalms where we lament, right,
Yeah.
where we're sad? And I think in real life, it's not just victories, right? Like, what do we do with war? What do we do with racial reconciliation and racism? Like, what do we do with those hard topics? We can't
Mm.
just brush it over. And I wonder if we're doing a disservice to our people where every time if we come to church on a weekend and there's stuff happening in the world, right, that people are dealing with and they're somber about, they're grieving, and we have three songs where it's all about winning and victory, right,
Yep.
and a message that's about winning and victory, and it's like, whoa, there's a disconnect with reality.
Mm.
And yeah, even as we transition to this last one, and for me at least, it feels like we went through this really fast, and I hope we have another opportunity in the future to have conversations about different topics.
Yeah.
I just want to say this, right? Even as we recognize that it's hard to have racial reconciliation conversations unless we actually stop and pause and think, right?
Yeah.
I do just want to enter this conversation and say that I recognize, even as a church leader at 168, there are topics of conversations that we're not doing a good job incorporating, right? That
Mm.
we're not doing a good job in bringing into the rhythm. And that's why we need the wider body and the wider church. And I really hope that this conversation, if you're not a part of the 168 community, doesn't feel alienating, but one of like, man, maybe there's something that this faith community is doing well, and we recognize there's stuff that we're not doing well. Like, how can we partner together for the larger kingdom, right? How
Yeah.
can we help each other to become more holistic and work through some of our blind spots? So that's really the hope here.
Love that.
Yeah. All right. So here's the last one. What are some, and this is with the context of the fact that we do have some resources for adults already on our website. So what are some kids resources available that you would recommend when it comes to this conversation?
Yeah, I love this question. So this is kind of right where my family is right now. So if you guys, I have three kids, all under the age of 10. And I think one of the things that we've challenged ourselves to is that my kids are biracial. So there are multiple sides of their lives that they have to put together. And so my wife and I, we thought just from the beginning, like this is something that we need to just begin to teach them, but also allow them to process through their
Yeah.
lives with the hope that as they get older, not that it becomes normal for them, but that they have processed and that they've bounced off of us and know that we are resources for them to bounce things off of and talk to. And if they need more assistance, to get them that more assistance they need. But one book that I would recommend is actually, it's called Stamped for Kids. So there's an adult
Mm-hmm.
version of the book called Stamped from the Beginning. The author is actually quoted as calling it a not history book, but
Mm-hmm.
it just goes through the history of racism, not only in America but just how it started worldwide. And then he does a great job of like categorizing movements as abolitionist movements, assimilation movement, and like complete anti-racist movements. But the book Stamped for Kids is actually shorter, so the chapters are like 3 pages long with great questions to ask your child and just discuss with your child. That book I would recommend. I mean, that can be for any age, but I definitely think your older children will have a great discussion with that book as
Yeah.
well.
So what grade would you recommend?
I would say like my daughter's 10, like so she's like in the fourth grade. I think it's like right in line for her, so like fourth grade and up. But I believe that like my kindergartner and my second grader as well, like could handle the questions in that book and they could ask me questions. They may be different levels, but I think
Yeah,
the more
totally.
they can hear it earlier, it's not outrageous where you're gonna like traumatize your child. It's just great information to know. But even for those younger kids under the age of 10, we love reading books that just highlight culture and heritage for
Mm,
children. So like our kids being biracial, like we have things with like hair and names and things. So we've read some
mm,
books. Like one's called I Am Enough, and it's just talking about it's confidence for your child and being like you are enough in the way that God has created you in all your
mm,
faults and all of your failures. Like you are enough. For there, there's one that just says my name sings, and it talks about the culture of names and how just because in America these names are normal and they make sense, they have their meanings. But sometimes kids who have different names, like their names have significant meaning in their culture and their heritage.
mm,
And we love that book for our kids. And there's some other ones that we actually have on the docket that just reading through I love. Is like one's called 13 Ways of Looking at Black Boys. And the author's goal was like, man, there's so many negative images about black men and black boys out in the media. What does it look like to compile a book of positive images, positive poems of black boys in
mm.
America? So having a 5-year-old son, like I'm super stoked to read him that book.
Yeah.
And there's another one just called Change Things. And it's a great book about how your kids, even in their own context, can be a part of doing what's right, even in their little context. So those are a few books that like my family has gone through that I could recommend. I think
Yeah.
the other thing for parents is like even outside of your kid's normal school rhythm, like find historical figures in America and like do not just like the highlights of their life, but like research their life and research all that they have had to overcome because of being female or being a certain race in a BIPOC community and like just the history of our country and like really do the research and have the conversations and like show your students or your kids, that this is a real thing and that these people did overcome it, but like they also, had to fight through some stuff that on the flip side, a person who, at the time was white and American, like didn't have to do. They could just kind of
Mm,
blitz through
yeah.
those things. So I think that's what I like. Those are my recommendations for kids. I think the more like be age appropriate for your kids, conversation appropriate. I'm not going to tell you to go show your 5-year-old like a YouTube video of Philando Castile or anything like that, but you can have the conversation about what's going on and honestly hear
Mm,
them out. You hear how they're processing, hear how they're thinking. And if you feel inadequate in the conversation, that's okay. Like it's okay to be uncomfortable. Let that drive you back, to do your own research. Let that drive you back to taking your research of history to the word of the Lord and allowing him to be full in you and then lean on the Holy Spirit, right? As we learn, we're going through a series in Romans, and as we learn, like the Holy Spirit is like at the strongest in our weakness. The Holy Spirit intercedes for us when we are weak. And in those moments where you feel inadequate and weak, like lean on the Holy Spirit to speak
mm.
through you to your child. And I mean, we're always talking about the intersectionality of faith and racial reconciliation. And this is it, like right here.
Totally, yeah. And I just want to point back to Amnesty International, right? The second one was face the uncomfortable truth. I mean, we all feel uncomfortable at times through this process, and that's okay. And the books that Carl just listed, we'll put it on our website. We're going to revamp some of it so that, again, I think there are two different genres that he talked about, right? One of them is the intersection of faith and racial reconciliation, and how do we help navigate our kids through that process, or young kids, right? You might not be a parent, but maybe you're an aunt or an uncle, or you have little kids in your life somehow. And then the second was just how do we provide books that represent kids of color in reality, right? In a helpful, healthy way. And so we'll put that all online for you. Hey, I just want to close. I just love the fact that we had the opportunity to share here, and thanks for taking time to listen to this show. And I hope you find a normal rhythm of incorporating and working through kind of what it means to be a reconciler, not just during the month of February, but
Mm.
again, as I said, in a normal rhythm of life. And so, as we say often here, we have 168 hours in a week. Would you use every single one of them for Jesus?